Now then, let's talk about the importance of soil texture. If you have a soil that's real high in clay, it'll hold a lot of water. But sometimes that water is held so tightly by the clay particles that it's not available to the plant. And if you have a soil that's high in sand, it doesn't hold much water, but of course it gives it up quite readily. So our textures that are best suited to supplying water to plants typically have a high silt content, 20 to 30% clay, and less than 50% sand. If you look at high yield corn results over a number of years, almost always the soils that yield the highest in corn are silty soils. And we're blessed here in central Indiana, as well as the Midwest, to have a lot of silty soils. And continuing on with the importance of soil texture, obviously it's important to till. That's a fancy word. How easy can you work it? You know? If you're going to plant some materials that are hard to dig, is it crumble up easy in your hands, those kind of things. And obviously when you get high clay contents, then the till becomes typically not as good as when you have more silt and more sand. And then plant growth is tied so much to soil texture. One of the things we talk about is cation exchange capacity. That's a fancy word, I know, but it's how well does that soil hang on to the nutrients. And really and truly, it's a pretty important issue for water quality, because if we have real sandy soils, or if we have some soils that have some clay in it, but it's the wrong kind of clay, it doesn't have good ability to hold on to nutrients, the material will leach through, get into water supplies, and we'll have more contamination than from soils that have a high cation exchange capacity and are able to hang on to those nutrients for longer periods of time. And then soil strength obviously is tied to the texture. We get soils real high in silt. So one thing wrong with high silt soils is they erode very easily. They also don't have much strength when you go to build on them. You get a mixture of sand and clay, say a sandy clay texture, sandy clay loam texture, have a lot of strength. They'll able to support a load. And then we touched a bit on water movement, but obviously that's tied to soil texture also. Again, obviously the sandier the soil, typically the better it moves water, but there's always exceptions to those kind of things. This is simply a lab data sheet. You probably can't read it. Just wanted to point out, and probably some of you folks utilize labs, but when I worked for SCS, we did send a lot of samples to the lab, and they would analyze it for sand, silt, and clay, and a whole bunch of other things. But there's labs here in Indiana, there's one in Fort Wayne, there's probably some more scattered around the state that will provide this service. You send them a sample, and they can send you back sand, silt, clay, and pH, and a whole bunch of them. It's an excellent way to calibrate your fingers, just in case you take a lab sample to say, am I calling this right? Am I really getting the ballpark of what the texture is? The second thing we want to talk about is soil structure. And soils are composed of the sand, silt, and clay aggregated together into small bodies that are separated by natural planes of weakness. And that sounds kind of fancy, but that's basically, where does the soil break? When you dig out the soil, and say you might just drop it here on the table, does it break apart, or does it remain intact? Does it break apart into little pebble-like things, or is it more of a blocky structure? So, and those small bodies, separated by those natural planes of weakness, are called beds. So, soils are composed of sand, silt, and clay that segregate into beds, and then aggregated into different layers. So, here's some examples of soil structure. There on the left, the granular structures, what we hope to see in our topsoil. In fact, here in Indiana, if it's not been disturbed, that's almost always the case. We'll have a nice granular structure. And you can imagine, remember, water moves through voids in the soil, and you can see how many voids you would have in good granular structure. That water will move very well in soils with granular structure. Then on the right is the rocky structure. That's typical of our subsoils. This is where the soil breaks apart in little chunks. sometimes a quarter-inch, some up to a half-inch in size. Obviously, you don't have near the pore space or the voids in the blocky structure that you would in the granular structure. And then we have plated structure. That occurs to a limited extent naturally in soils, but where that becomes a real issue is when we have compaction. We can take the granular structure from the topsoil, run across it with equipment, and we compress that into a plated structure. And you can see that there's trouble with water movement in plated structure. You only have voids there, so the water in plated structure as well as the roots. You might have a root go down like this, and then it hits one of those plates, moves horizontally, and then finds another crack and goes down. And I'm sure water follows that same pattern, so you really restrict water movement when you get into plated structure. Most of the time when we look at compacted soils, that's what we see is plated structure. Now I might mention down here in the lower right where it says prismatic, for some of you folks that might work down in southern Indiana, say southern Morgan County and Brown County, through that area, we have soils that have what we call fragipans in. And there, this prismatic structure forms naturally in the soil. And it causes lots of problems for septic systems, for water movement, because these prisms are oftentimes 3 or 4 inches across, and the water doesn't move through that prism at all. It goes through the voids. So water goes down, and these fragipans are typically, anywhere from 20 to 35 inches below the surface. So you get water going down, hits the fragipan, and then it starts to move off horizontally, and a lot of times you get the hillside seeps. You see those green strips down in southern Indiana? The old septic system is the effluents kind of coming to the surface because it's perching on top of the fragipan. We don't really have a trouble with prismatic structure here in central Indiana. But when you get south of the Wisconsin-Till boundary, which is roughly Brown County area, southern Morgan County, that becomes an issue. This is just an example of topsoil and good granular structure. Hopefully you can see, but you could break that down to around 11 inches. That will just break into chunks smaller than a match head, and just excellent example of granular structure. It happens to come out of my garden, so it hasn't been disturbed too much. But if you go into a wooded area where it's not been disturbed, you'll see probably even better structure than that. Sometimes the granules are so small I can hardly see them. But of course, that's excellent for water movement. Then this would be an example of blocky structure. And this would be from the subsoil area. Those individual blocks are roughly, the large ones are about a ½ inch and the smaller ones are a quarter inch or less. But this is an example of what we call strong blocky structure. That's very desirable for our subsoils. We aren't going to get the granular structure in the subsoil, but what we'd like to have is really strong blocky structure if we want water to move. And water will move, as you can imagine, pretty well in this subsoil. And most of these beds are small, maybe an 1/8 inch up to about 3/4 of an inch in size. Typically will handle most of our soils. And we talk about the strength of development. Is that structure strong, weak, or moderate? And so the stronger the structure, the better we're going to get water movement and typically root penetration.